Hello everyone. My topic today is cold fusion will lower the cost of both energy and equipment. I wrote a paper about this in 2016, which you can read at leonardcanner.org. And here is another look at the subject. Let's start with some assumptions. With enough R&D, cold fusion will be controllable. It will have high power density and good Carnot efficiency, so heat engines will be compact. That much is certain. I'm pretty sure of the following. Cells will be inexpensive. They are simple small devices. Unless palladium is needed, the materials will not be expensive, so they should cost about as much as batteries. Cells will be safe. Tritium will either be absent or fully contained, the way it is contained in hallway exit signs today. Did you know that exit signs have tritium? The COP will be high or infinite. COP means the ratio of input power to output power, the coefficient of production. This is a big problem today. Electrochemical cells sometimes need far more input power than you get out as excess heat. On the other hand, some gas-loaded cells produce excess heat with no input power. The COP is infinite. I assume input power will be reduced to a minimum or eliminated. Unfortunately, cold fusion cells today are far from what I describe. They cannot be controlled. They are difficult to replicate. Most produce only a fraction of a watt, although a few have produced 100 watts or more. How can we make them into a practical source of energy? As I see it, here is what must happen. First, it must become generally known that cold fusion is real and that it will probably replace other sources of energy. Once that happens, large industrial corporations will spend a ton of money on R&D. I suppose $10 million per day for 5 years, $18 billion total. Corporations have spent $19 billion on self-driving cars so far, so this is in the same ballpark. Will this R&D succeed? Probably. It usually does. Look at history. Can cold fusion produce high temperatures and steady power? Can it produce power density high enough for practical use? Yes, I am certain it can, because it already has in a few experiments. One produced 100 watts continuously for 30 days. If something can happen once in a laboratory, we can learn how to make it happen 1,000,000 times a day in the real world. Will corporations spend $18 billion on cold fusion? They sure will, because if they don't, their competition will put them out of business. That's the same reason automobile companies are frantically working on self-driving cars. The other reason they will spend $18 billion is their revenues will be roughly $10 trillion over 30 years, so $18 billion is a drop in the bucket. Here is the basis of my $10 trillion estimate. I estimate we will spend $340 billion per year on cold fusion generators, water heaters, and other equipment. I describe this in detail below. That $340 billion will go to the industrial companies that make the equipment. Most will go to the first movers, because once you take the lead in something like this, you keep it for a long time. $340 billion for 30 years is $10.2 trillion. The $10.2 trillion will come out of the pockets of the energy companies. GE will transfer a large chunk of revenue from ExxonMobil to itself, the way automobile companies transferred revenue from passenger railroads to themselves. End users worldwide today pay $6.8 trillion for fossil fuel and electricity. $340 billion is 20 times less. Such a drastic cost reduction is irresistible. People will stop buying gasoline and electricity. Energy companies will go bankrupt. After 20 years, patents will expire, competition will increase, and cold fusion will become a commodity. Profits will be lower. Still, over 30 years, the first movers will make trillions of dollars in revenue. Becoming a commodity means competition drives down the cost until it approaches the cost of production. We can estimate the cost of production from the materials, the degree of precision manufacturing, and so on. No doubt the first cold fusion generators will sell at a huge premium, but the cost of production will be low. As I said, a cold fusion cell should cost about as much as a battery. The heat engines will cost about as much as today's models. From this, we can predict cold fusion generators will eventually be much cheaper than power company generators. Let's estimate how much cheaper. Start with your electric power bill. In most cities, the bill now shows two main items, supply and delivery. Supply is the cost of the generator and fuel. They're both about 1/3 of the total cost. Delivery, the cost of delivering the power over the grid, also around 1/3. So the cost is evenly split three ways: the generator, the fuel, and the grid. Cold fusion does not need fuel or the grid, which leaves only the generator. It is 2/3 cheaper from the get-go. So how much will a cold fusion generator cost? To estimate that, let's look at a 58 megawatt LM6000 gas turbine generator from GE. It costs around $50 million, around $960 per kilowatt of capacity. The overnight capital cost comes to $1,376 per kilowatt of capacity. This is a masterpiece of 21st century technology. Incredibly efficient. It has to be, because otherwise the fuel would end up costing a lot. This generator is optimized for efficiency. And here is a Chevrolet automobile engine, 145 kilowatts. It is abominably inefficient. You would weep to hear how inefficient. However, it costs only $1,460 with free shipping. It comes to $10 per kilowatt. That's 130 times cheaper than the GE generator. It is 600 times cheaper than some other power company generators. It is cheaper because it is mass-produced and because it is optimized for low cost. Since cold fusion energy costs nothing, we will optimize the equipment for low cost. It will soon be far cheaper than today's power company generator. Decades later, hundreds of times cheaper. Now, I realize that a motor is not a generator. You have to add an alternator, but that does not cost much. There are other differences such as the duty cycle. I discussed these in the paper. Cold fusion energy is free, but then so is wind and sunlight. Why should cold fusion be cheaper than wind or solar? Yes, the equipment will be optimized for low cost. People are optimizing wind and solar for low cost. But these sources have problems that will never allow them to be as cheap as cold fusion, including low power density, intermittency, limited availability. You need a lot of sunlight or wind. Wind needs a distribution grid because it only works with gigantic machines, most of them far from cities. Solar needs a grid because power density is low. Solar density is so low that in many parts of the U.S., such as the Midwest, even if you cover a large roof with panels, they produce only about 612 kilowatt hours per month. The average U.S. house consumes 911 kilowatt hours per month, so you need supplemental electricity from the grid. You have to pay for the grid even when you have solar. In this slide on the right is a 20 kilowatt deluxe standby generator. A 20 kilowatt cold fusion home generator will be about this big. It will produce up to 14,600 kilowatt hours a month. You see, it is much smaller than the solar array. It is also far smaller than your share of power company equipment, because that includes the generator, high voltage power lines, the poles, wires, and those round transformers in your neighborhood, plus the coal mines, the railroads that bring the coal, natural gas pipelines, and so on. You do not see all that stuff, so you do not realize how big it is, or how expensive. That 20 kilowatt deluxe standby generator costs $6,400 at Lowe's. An ordinary 20 kilowatt gasoline generator is about $4,000. Costs per kilowatt range from $113 to $305. Still much higher than the Chevy engine, because they are not made in such large numbers. Power company generators range from $1,327 per kilowatt for solar photovoltaic, up to $3,000 for coal plants, or $6,600 for deluxe coal plants. Plus you have to pay for the coal. You see why no one builds coal plants these days. Assuming the cold fusion cell itself is not expensive, with today's equipment a home generator will be about 10 times cheaper than a power company generator. Mass production will bring down the cost. I suggest we manufacture 170 million gadgets per year, about twice as many as the number of automobiles we make. This would meet worldwide demand for energy. They would be mostly generators, but also things like water heaters and pumps. I think the average size would be 20 kilowatts, which is what most houses in the US and Europe need. Some would be smaller, 1 or 2 kilowatts, useful for portable power or power in the third world. 20 kilowatt generators now cost $4,000, but manufactured in large numbers, I expect the price will soon fall to around $2,000, including the cell. Eventually, after years of mass production, it may fall to the level of the $10 per kilowatt Chevy engine, plus an alternator and battery, around $600. For now, let's assume they will cost $2,000 per unit. Suppose we make 170 million per year. Suppose they last 15 years, which is about how long internal combustion engines or refrigerator compressors last. After 15 years, there would be 2.6 billion in service, which is enough to produce all of the energy in the world. The cost would be 340 billion per year, which is 9% of what we now pay for automobiles, or 5% of what we now pay for energy. They would be 20 times cheaper than today's energy, as I said. After 15 years, worldwide capacity would be 51,000 gigawatts of electricity. If we ran all the equipment continuously for a year, we would generate 7 times more electricity than we do today. I'm not suggesting we should do that, or that we would do that. People do not run home generators or water heaters at full capacity 24/7. I am saying we would have that much energy available, on tap whenever we want it. The point of making far more capacity than we have now, or than we would actually use at any given moment, is to give everyone access to all the energy they want without the expense of a distribution grid. Low-cost core technology lowers all costs. 340 billion per year is what the generators would cost at first, but costs would gradually fall. Think about the development of the personal computer. This began with the microprocessor chip. That is the heart of the personal computer, but you also need RAM, a keyboard, a screen, a hard disk, and a printer. When personal computers were introduced, these things were expensive. They were manufactured in small numbers for the mini-computer market. There was no such thing as a small printer for the home market. Personal computers began selling in the thousands and then millions. Engineers worked frantically to make small, cheap printers. Prices fell rapidly. When the cost of core technology falls, it creates an opportunity to invent peripherals. There would be no point to developing a $300 printer in 1975. You could not sell more than a few hundred. But when the market for printers explodes and millions are sold, it is worth developing a new type of cheap, small printer. Cold fusion will be the core technology in many machines. They will sell in larger numbers, and they will get cheaper. The 20 kilowatt generators I described would have conventional heat engines. I suppose steam piston or turbine mechanical generators. It would be better to develop thermoelectric devices because they have no moving parts and they last much longer. These are far more expensive per kilowatt today, but with R&D they can probably be made much cheaper, the way photovoltaic cells were. One of the reasons this R&D will cost $18 billion is that we need to invent many new things to take advantage of cold fusion. To make full use of personal computers, we needed new kinds of printers, as I said. To make full use of cold fusion, we will need many new inventions, especially better heat engines. The people who invent cold fusion cells will not be the only ones to make a ton of money. Whoever comes up with a better heat engine will also make a fortune. I assume that thermoelectric heat engines will be used with small devices, such as wristwatches and cell phones. To illustrate the challenges of developing cold fusion, challenges other than the cold fusion cell itself, let me describe a problem with this. Any small heat engine is inefficient. Today's thermoelectric devices are particularly inefficient. This makes them too hot for cell phones or laptop computers. They are 15% efficient, so a cell phone would generate 20 watts of waste heat, too hot for your pocket. Laboratory devices are 40% efficient, so the phone would generate 7.5 watts, probably cool enough. But there is another problem. Like all heat engines, thermoelectric Carnot efficiency is better at higher temperatures. You can only get 15% today, or 40% in the future, when the hot side temperature is 1230 Kelvin, 930 degrees Celsius. That would be fine for something like a home generator, but how could you put such a hot object in your pocket? Well, I have thought of one way. Imagine a gas-loaded cold fusion cathode the size of an incandescent light bulb tungsten filament that is kept at 930 degrees Celsius. It is encased in ceramic, which is surrounded by thermoelectric devices. The heat is radiated evenly from the surface of the phone, making it only moderately warm. But what if you drop the phone, or you run over it with a car? The ceramic may crack open and expose the incandescent core. I suppose the reaction would stop and it would rapidly cool, but it might be dangerous. Then again, a conventional cell phone battery can be dangerous. Run over one with a car, and it might discharge quickly and ignite or explode. I have no idea whether a hot ceramic core would work, but I expect someone will come up with a solution. I hope super efficient thermoelectric devices that convert 40% at moderate temperatures are possible, because that would be best. For larger machines such as home generators, the 930 degrees Celsius temperature would be as safe as the natural gas flame in your water heater. One of the best potential uses of cold fusion would be for a cardiac pacemaker. A cold fusion thermoelectric pacemaker that lasts for 50 years would be a great benefit to patients because the battery-powered ones we have now have to be replaced from time to time. An incandescent core might be acceptable in a cell phone, but you would not put one in a pacemaker battery. No one would implant that in a patient's chest. Fortunately, that will not be necessary. It turns out that for very low power levels, inefficient heat engines are fine. As long as the COP is very high, or infinitely high with no input power, cold fusion will work. Here is a small thermoelectric nuclear-powered pacemaker from the 1970s. It is powered by plutonium-238, which produces heat without significant radiation, around 15 millirams per hour. This device produced 130 milliwatts of heat, which converted to about 50 microwatts of electricity. Conversion efficiency was 0.04%. That was okay. The 130 milliwatts of waste heat did not cause a problem in the patient's chests. Incidentally, some of these pacemakers were still implanted and functioning after 30 years. So a nuclear-powered pacemaker really is robust and can last for a long time. There is one marvelous possibility on the horizon. Frank Gordon and Harper Whitehouse have developed and experimentally demonstrated a device they call a lattice energy converter, LEC, which produces both a voltage and a current through a load. Several people in fact, have independently replicated these results. While the LEC is simple in appearance, it is extremely complicated to analyze. However, it appears to be a cold fusion device that directly generates electricity with no input power. I have often referred to cold fusion as the ideal source of energy. This would be the ideal. You don't need a heat engine. Electricity converts to mechanical power, light, or heat with high efficiency. In its present state, the output will have to be increased by 9 orders of magnitude to reach 1 kilowatt. That sounds ridiculous, but laboratory science often accomplishes such things. Look at the first fission reactor, the Chicago Pile 1, which produced 0.5 watts. The first power reactor a few years later produced 236 megawatts thermal, 8 orders of magnitude more. Gordon will be presenting the latest results from the LEC at this conference. Don't miss it. Cold fusion will soon reduce the cost of energy by a factor of 20. In the distant future, energy will be hundreds of times cheaper. The whole notion that energy can be made hundreds of times cheaper may seem ridiculous to some people. These people have not read history. The cost of food and many other things has fallen dramatically since the Industrial Revolution began. In particular, intangible things are far cheaper, things like travel, lighting, and information. Energy is an intangible. Here's the cost of lighting from 1800 to 2000. It fell by a factor of 3,300, while efficiency increased 700 times. Over the last 50 years, the cost of information, data storage, and computation fell more than any other commodity in history. From 1962 to 2000, the cost of computer memory fell by 8 orders of magnitude. I personally own more terabytes of disk storage than existed in the entire world in 1964. Of course, these things are cheaper because they became much smaller. As I said, cold fusion will also be cheaper, in part because the equipment will be smaller. It will not need those high voltage power lines, poles and transformers, or the coal mines and railroads, gas pipelines, and all the rest of the unseen infrastructure we must have for today's energy. And that is all I have to say. Thank you.